Welcome to WEL Partners on Predatory Marriages, a limited podcast series. My name is Jaclyn, and I'm joined by Daphne Franks, a longtime champion of better protections against predatory marriages. Now, today we are talking about assumptions. As we've talked about predatory marriages, Daphne has mentioned a lot of things that professions have assumed about each other, about her mom, about the entire situation surrounding her experience with predatory marriages. So to supplement this, I've written a blog post on marriage licensing safeguards that do and don't exist in Canada, because it's a little more complicated. It varies a lot from province to province. But I want to open the floor up to Daphne, and if you could just let us know what you mean when you're talking about assumptions.
Well, soon after my mum died, we heard so many people, very educated people, doctors, solicitors, making assumptions about what might have happened. And so many people started sentences with, but surely, that my brother and I were thinking of getting T-shirts with, but surely written on them, because we heard it such a lot. And one of the main assumptions early on was, but did she have a diagnosis of dementia? Because if she did, she wouldn't have been allowed to marry. And that's just one huge assumption. First of all, she did have a 5-year diagnosis of dementia, but that didn't mean she wouldn't have been allowed to marry. And I would argue very strongly, it shouldn't mean that, because many people with dementia are perfectly fit to marry. And I want to say that very strongly, just in case anyone thinks I'm going, no, anyone with dementia shouldn't be able to marry. So that was the first assumption, that a diagnosis of dementia would stop someone being able to marry. And then they said, but don't the registrars look at their medical records? Well, no, they don't. And again, I would argue that they shouldn't. And some people have said, well, there must be a cut-off, or surely there should be a cut-off. So, for example, if you're over 60, you have to have your medical records looked at before you get married. Or if you're over 70, or if you're over 80. Wouldn't agree with any of that, because I think that is against your human rights. And I think human rights organisations would quite rightly have something to say about that. So I don't think there should be a connection with medical records. What I think there should be, and again, another assumption, is that there should be robust procedures at marriage. And I want to emphasise that I'm not blaming the registrars for the lack of robust procedures. It's just that the laws and procedures have not kept up with the big rise in dementia. In the UK, registrars,
sorry, just so when
yeah, you wanted to clarify what a registrar is.
Yes, make sure everyone's on the same page, since there are different terms. Even within a singular province, people will use both marriage officiant, celebrant, a bunch of different terms. There's the people who will do the actual marriage ceremony, but then there's also the people who will issue a marriage license, which most provinces require, or at least all provinces and territories have, which gives you permission to get married, kind of, within the next 30 days, 3 months, something like that, depending on where you're at. So the registrant, is that the person issuing all of the paperwork, some of the paperwork, doing the ceremony?
The registrar
does that stuff?
Yeah, the registrar, and it might not be the same registrar, but the job is, you meet the couple at the notification of marriage, they turn up, and they both have to turn up several weeks before the marriage to give notice to marry. And at that point, they should be asked some questions. And it shouldn't really vary throughout the UK, or depending on who you are, but it really does. Some people get a real grilling and others don't, and it partly depends on the area of the country and how you look and all that kind of thing. So that's one thing that I think needs updating. So again, that's one assumption that people make, that it will be the same questions in each case. It's not. And some more astute registrars kind of wander off a bit and ask a few more searching questions just to find out what's going on. But the point is, they're not all at that standard, and it does vary throughout the country, which I think is a shame. Again, I think there is an overseeing body, the General Register Office, but really, traditionally, they've not overseen every register office in the country to the same standard. There are also, of course, religious marriages, and I have found, and I haven't, I'm not an expert, haven't done a huge amount of research into this, but the people I have spoken to, and I have spoken to quite a few, religious people who conduct marriages tend to do a bit more in-depth questioning or get to know the couple a bit better. Because, for example, a Church of England vicar would really want the couple they're marrying to be part of the congregation and to have seen them and to have attended the church and all that. Whereas in a register office, it's you turn up, you give your notification, you come back in a few weeks. And when you come back to get married, again, they should ask you the questions separately, but they don't always. And we know they didn't in my mum's case. So it's that assumption that there are robust safeguarding procedures in place. Do you have that term in Canada, safeguarding?
Yes.
That's what we, yeah. So that's what we would say to protect our elderly and our vulnerable. There are a lot of assumptions that these procedures were in place, and they just weren't, sadly.
Yeah, no, I have to admit, I was definitely guilty of some of those assumptions too. I mean, looking into different safeguards that do and don't exist in Canada as a part of this series with you, I was shocked to realize that, like, where my parents live, in theory, someone could go apply for a license online for themselves to marry another person.
Yeah,
As long as they have their ID and a couple pieces
yeah,
of ID for the other person, they could go by themselves to pick that license up. And I mean, I've spoken with, again, not any extensive number of, but I have spoken with people who officiate weddings, and their thing is we're taught to look out for narcotics or if
yeah,
one of the parties getting married is drunk, but like
yeah,
we aren't really trained on what to look for like if someone might not have decision making capacity for whatever the
absolutely.
legal test is to get married, that no one has taught me what that exists. um
And what is it? Because nobody knows. I mean, I've asked so many people, I've asked solicitors, registrars, what is the test to get married? What do you have to know? What do you have to be able to say? I would argue that part of that you should have to know the name of the person you're marrying, which, believe me, my mum never did. But there is nowhere has it been written down. What you need to know is this. What you need to say is this. And what registrars should say to stop a wedding is this. And as I think I've said before, I think it needs to be a properly written paragraph starting with the word unfortunately, because you haven't been able to answer these questions or whatever. And then the decision needs to be taken off the registrars. They need to um, refer the person for a capacity test. Because one of the big assumptions actually is that registrars are trained to a similar level as doctors or as solicitors, and they're not, and it's not fair. And I've often said to groups of people, so if you think registrars are professionals who are able to assess capacity, why aren't they paid more? They can be paid minimum wage in the UK or slightly more than that. So registrars are very up for this. They're kind of, yes, train us more, we'll be paid more. But actually, at the moment, the qualifications to be a registrar are very minimal. No strict educational prerequisites, a good level of general education, including English and maths, they want. But at the same time, if you Google how to become a registrar, it says a strong understanding of relevant legislation and legal processes is crucial. So those two things don't go together. They have added that in later, I would suggest, and they're not training people up to the required level. So I'd like to take the decision making away from the registrars or train them a lot better and pay them a lot more.
Now, who are you talking about when you're saying people assumed it'll be okay because there will be procedures? Who was it that was making that assumption?
Well, I worked, for example, I taught at medical school for a long time, and a lot of people making that assumption were very educated people, such as doctors, who kind of, well, there's got to be something in place. I remember one chap shouting at me across a crowded waiting room, saying, "You need to get that marriage annulled." And I kind of, oh my goodness, why hadn't I thought of that? But you cannot do it. You can't annul a marriage when one party has died in the UK unless it was bigamous or incestuous. And even if you could, the will would stay revoked. So all of that is a real mess that needs a bit of untangling, I would say. Some solicitors have said, and I was having this discussion very recently on LinkedIn, that you could sort it well, the solicitors said in the past you could sort it by asking when somebody gives power of attorney to their daughter, is it okay if you were told if your loved one was planning to marry? That would sort it and to some extent. But another way of sorting it would be to take that marriage revoking a will and make that void rather than voidable. So if the marriage was made void rather than voidable, then the will would be revoked. And actually, somebody said to me just yesterday, so all you'd have to do is prove that somebody lacked capacity to marry in that case, and then the marriage would be void and the will would be revoked and everything would be fine. And I sort of said to her, but how are you going to prove that the person lacked capacity to marry? Because one of the big assumptions is that there is some evidence at marriage. There isn't. There is no evidence, certainly not in the UK. You have your marriage certificate saying this marriage happened. There are two witnesses. They are just there to go, this marriage happened. They're not there to assess capacity. That's not what they're for. They're just there to witness that this marriage happened.
So it's not
So,
like there would be a doctor who would take notes of the appointment,
no,
thing like that.
no.
So there's not really a record aside from the license.
No,
That's your
but
experience.
there could very easily be an audio recording or preferably a video recording that was just done with a camera in the corner of the room, and the cost of it could be added to the cost of the marriage, and it would be absolutely negligible. And it could be just stored in the cloud as evidence. And the couple would have to be made aware of that, of course. But nevertheless, if there was a political will to do that, they could do it. And I'm totally convinced that if you could see a recording of my mother's wedding, anyone could see that she wasn't fit to marry. And that would also, I would argue, protect the registrars who could be seen to be doing their job.
Yeah. Another thing you mentioned in passing just there was being notified, because so you had substitute decision making for pretty much all decisions your mom had
Yeah,
to make, just because she
yeah,
had been declared to not have capacities for those things.
absolutely.
And
Yeah,
I think I'm correct in saying people assume that because those were in place, nobody would then think she had the capacity to enter into
yeah.
a marriage. What do you think should happen? Because I mean, obviously, on one hand, we don't want what happened to your mom happening to other people. And then on the other hand, like you pointed out, with your earlier point that, just because someone has a diagnosis of dementia doesn't mean they can't marry. We have to worry about being ageist or ableist as well. How do you balance
Absolutely.
those two things there?
I think everybody nationally, if marriage is a national institution, which it is, then everybody should have the same list of questions. And it's all right saying you could be rehearsed in those questions. Well, you could, but my mum still would not have had a clue. And if the bar for capacity for marriage is low, but if you'd have asked mum, how did you meet the person? She wouldn't have had a clue. Where do you live? She didn't know her address at the time of the marriage. What's your date of birth? She didn't know that. They wouldn't need to be difficult questions to show a lack of capacity. I'm very much in favour of people with learning disabilities being allowed to marry in some cases if they have capacity. But one of the problems with people with dementia is that most people wouldn't want to marry someone with dementia, and therefore there is usually a nefarious purpose for them doing it and a lot of grooming. And we know that the man had told mum and told her various things, but they didn't stick at the time of the wedding because she just couldn't remember because she had very bad dementia. So what I'm saying is it wouldn't be a difficult test. And the registrars they really need just something, a list of what do you do now, and to be trained in it, to be trained in what would you say. I've spent my whole career saying to doctors, so what would you say here? And making them practice it, because unless you sort of think it through and the words come out of your mouth, you can't do it in the moment when you're slightly nervous and surrounded by an expectant wedding party. They need training.
So the solution, in your opinion, isn't so much things like linking powers of attorney or medical documents or all those kind of sensitive documents to the marriage process. The solution is a bit more having those safeguards at that moment of marriage.
Having safeguards at the moment, I think, yeah, because things will always go wrong. One of the cases I've spoken to, they tried to put on a caveat, but the caveat, the person in the office who dealt with caveats was off sick, so the caveat was never done. So, and again, that is an assumption. Solicitors said, oh, well, you could have put on a caveat. What's a caveat? I hadn't got a clue and I wouldn't have known how to do it. I am in favour of a link with power of attorney, because for the power of an attorney to be kind of activated, the person has generally lost capacity. And I'm not asking for anything other than the attorney to be told. And again, I think that decision needs to be down to the donor, the person giving power of attorney, at the moment they give it, to be asked. But I'm not in favour, definitely not in any links with medical records or anything like that. I think that's just too far. What age do you stop doing that, or when do you start doing that? When someone's 18, it just doesn't make sense. It's not fair. It's not right. I know lots of people say it's not British, so but yeah, I don't think that's the way to go.
So then something like in which again the terms vary a little from province to province, but in a power of attorney document for personal care, you think maybe something like, if this happens, then I want my lawyers to notify this agency that would make sure a caveat is in, or what that would make sure that my power, the person in power for my power of attorney, gets notified. That sort of thing is what you'd like to see?
Absolutely. And that could be done because we have invented computers. It couldn't have been done very easily, say 30, 40 years. It couldn't. But now it could. It'd be done really easily. It just needs the political will to do it. And that's not there at the moment. And I think it needs to be. I think nobody is looking carefully enough. People are beginning to realize there's a heck of a lot of abuse of elderly people, but they haven't quite got into what needs to be done about this. And the reason I have, obviously, is because of our devastating personal experience.
Okay. This has been an amazing conversation for me, because obviously I'm someone who's young going into the legal field. And I think I'm correct in taking away a big part of this is that different disciplines need to talk to each other.
Absolutely.
People who are in charge of marrying people know things that lawyers don't, vice versa, same with police, social workers, when it comes to predatory marriages. So I really appreciate you, Daphne. This brings us to the end of our podcast for today. Next time, Daphne and I are going to discuss whether what happened to her mom in England, which, if you haven't heard the first episode of the podcast, unfortunately, Daphne's mom was a victim of predatory marriage. We're going to discuss whether or not that would likely happen here, because, I mean, a lot of our laws are similar to the UK. So please, I encourage you to subscribe and follow wherever you listen to your podcasts, and tune in next time. Until then, please stay safe and stay well.